Hi everyone, this is episode 8 of the Metaphysics of Physics podcast. I am Ashna, your host and guide through the hallowed halls of the philosophy of science. Thanks for tuning in. With this show, we are fighting for a more rational world, mostly by looking through the lens of the philosophy of science. We raise awareness of issues within the philosophy of science and present alternative and rational approaches. You can find all the episodes, transcripts, and subscription options on the website at metaphysicsofphysics.com. Today we will be doing a Q&A episode revolving around the theme of the universe and creationism. These are questions we found looking around the Quora platform, where Dwayne has an account if you wish to follow. We will also be answering a question submitted by one of our listeners. Okay, so let's begin. What would a non-mathematical universe look like? It would, ignoring parts of Earth and possibly other worlds with intelligent life, look much the same as it does now. Mathematics is a science of method invented by people to help them measure things. Without it, we would lack the ability to do much science and we would know almost nothing about the world or our universe. Without it, we would know nothing about engineering and we would be unable to build most of the technology that we have. But other than the fact that the universe would lack all those things people built, it would be much the same. Despite what many physicists believe, mathematics is not fundamental to the universe. It is just something people use to measure things in the universe. Some people cannot understand the unreasonable success of mathematics. Well, it is not unreasonable at all. It is entirely predictable and obvious if you understand what mathematics is: a method of quantifying relationships and performing measurements. If you know that, then why should it be surprising that mathematics is able to quantify and measure the universe? How or why did the Creator create the universe? Firstly, who said the universe was created? The universe is simply all that exists. It presupposes some kind of existence. There is no explaining existence. An explanation would require something to already exist. Any explanation would presuppose something to exist. A creator would suppose that something existed, at least himself. But are we meant to suppose that he is the only thing that existed way back in time? That he is some kind of omnipotent being? Sorry, everything that exists has a nature. But to have a specific nature means that there are some things you can do and some things that you cannot. That therefore limits and logically excludes omnipotence, or even the kind of power that allows one to create a universe. How is having a creator that can create a universe any kind of logical explanation? And more obviously, once you decide that the universe has to be created, you need to invent a creator. But then you need to explain that creator. You need another creator and then another one and another one. It is creators all the way down. I suppose one could assume that the creator just magically appeared out of nothing. But if we are going to accept that, is it not simply easier to assume the universe appeared out of nothing? But neither the universe nor a creator can appear out of nowhere. If nothing existed, then there is nothing that can cause a creator or a universe to come to exist. No, the only possibility we are really left with is that the universe always existed, which is the same as saying that something has always existed. No creator. Sorry. How are atheists so adamant that there's no God? Isn't that just as naive as believing there is one? No, there is nothing naive about requiring evidence to believe that something exists. And there is absolutely no evidence that God exists. Just a bunch of claims that never match observable reality and never stand up to a moment of rational thought. Why should we believe that there is a God? I guess if we ignore logic and reality and just accept nonsensical claims of faith, then we could find a so-called reason. But I am not willing to do those things. But it is worse than that. The very nature of God is just impossible. The laws of nature and logic make it clear that no such being could ever exist. By definition, any God is supernatural and thus outside the bounds of nature. There is nothing at all naive about not finding any reason to believe God is possible, and indeed finding 1,000 reasons why he could not possibly exist. Let me deal with one objection some of you might raise. Isn't this trying to prove a negative? And I thought you could not prove a negative. That does not apply here. If someone makes a claim that contradicts rational metaphysics, the laws of physics, or other known aspects of reality, then you most certainly can prove that it is false. Simply show that if it was true, it would contradict reality. This establishes that it is false. So let's try to prove that there are no gods. What is a god? A magical, usually anthropomorphic, immortal being. Well, if a god existed, he would have to obey the law of identity and would not be allowed to have magic. Nor would he be immortal. So, no, gods cannot exist. Not if being magical and immortal are essential aspects of being a god. Since such a being is impossible, he clearly cannot exist. That is why some atheists are so certain that no God can exist. It would be worse than naive to believe an impossible entity could possibly exist. Why can't God speak for himself rather than using books? I'm guessing because he figures he prefers people to have faith that he exists rather than direct evidence. It is not a matter of faith to believe someone exists when you hear them speak directly to you. Or it could be because he does not exist, and it is easier to fake the written word of God than the oral equivalent. Trying to fake the spoken word of God has a few problems. For one, he sounds quite mortal and not divine, unless you have a huge special effects budget, which was clearly not available at the time Christianity was being created. You could also have God only speak to certain people, but that has the obvious problem of you then having to just take their word for it. Not a problem if you are taking all this stuff on faith anyway. As an atheist, I am going with it just being easier to fake. If you say that he prefers mortals to write his word for him. Having it in a book also makes it easier for a few reasons, some of which I will explore in no particular order. Firstly, remember that in those days, most people could not read. In fact, priests were often some of the only people that could read. So, if God did not speak directly, then how could they know what God said? They have to consult his book. Who can read it? The priests. This made it very easy for priests to become important and powerful people. It also makes it easier to maintain their status as mysterious cults. If only the priests can read the word of God, then they are perceived as holders of knowledge that most people cannot have, which increases their perceived authority. It also makes it harder for people to argue with the priests. Imagine that some believers disagreed with the meaning of the religious texts. If God spoke to people, then people could try clear it up with God. At least they could if he existed. But if the word of God is only in written form, and the priests do not want to admit that they are wrong, this is much easier if almost nobody else can read the word of God. Then they can just tell people what they think the text says and not have to worry about people being able to check for themselves. So, in short, I believe that the two major reasons why the Christian God and many others do not speak directly to most of their believers and instead speak through holy texts are that A. The gods do not exist, and it is thus easier to pretend that they do by using holy texts. B. Holy texts give priests and their various churches more power and perceived credibility in cultures where most people cannot read the holy texts. Why don't atheists admit that they can't explain existence? Why do we have to explain existence? Obviously, existence exists. Everyone knows that, even the most dishonest creationist. There is no explaining existence. It simply is. Any explanation of it would presuppose something that exists in order to be able to explain existence. Existence has no cause. A cause presupposes the existence of something in order to cause it. Introducing God into the mix makes things no better. If God existed before everything else, then God was at that point all of existence. Why then should I not ask you, can't you admit that you cannot explain God? Saying because God is magic is not an answer, which I believe you know, because if I said the universe just appeared out of nothing and then exploded, you would laugh. Why then isn't it equally absurd to argue that God just appeared out of nowhere and created the universe out of nothing? And if we must explain existence, why can't we demand that you explain God? But you can't explain God because he does not exist, so any attempt to explain existence is by necessity circular and futile. Existence exists, now and always has. Existence has no explanation. It just is. Accept it. So these atheists will freely admit that we cannot explain existence, and then tell you that we should never be asked to. Do you think unexplained events are a proof of the existence of God? No. I think unexplained events are a proof that we have not explained everything yet. This question makes a major leap or two. First, it assumes that God exists, which has never been established, and since magical beings are impossible, never will be. So, if God does not exist, how can the fact that we cannot explain things prove that God does exist? But let us suppose that we believe he exists. There is still no reason to jump to God did it. That is just a God of the gaps argument, where you assume that everything science cannot explain must be explained by God. Why must it be explained by God? Why not assume that reason can explain it, and just because we do not know the answer does not mean that we cannot find the answer? I can tell you one thing, the answer will not be God. Every time someone has assumed that, they have been shown to be wrong. The correct answer is never God did it. Just because we cannot explain something now does not mean that we will not find an answer later. Unless we assume it was God, then we stop looking for the real answer and we never find it. Why then should we ever assume that anything we cannot explain has anything to do with God? Now let us answer a question submitted by one of our listeners regarding the particle-wave duality of light discussed in episode 7 on Bohr's philosophy. Thank you, Steve, for this question. Steve says, I just listened to your podcast regarding Niels Bohr. I understand your objection to the duality nature of particles as a violation of the law of identity. I also understand your discussion of particles being entities while waves are abstractions about the organization of particles. So, translating this to nature of light, is it proper to make the following statements? 1. The current scientific understanding of what light is not correct. It is not a wave because it leaves out the thing that is waving. Sub-question, so a field would not qualify as a thing that waves. 2. Science can demonstrate different properties of light. These demonstrations allow us to predict behavior and experimental outcome. But this is not the same as saying we know what light is. Good question. The short answer is yes. It is accurate and proper to make those statements. The main point of that part of the episode was, of course, to demonstrate that whatever light is, it is not a wave and a particle. But that does not do much to tell us what light actually is. We can say that whatever light is, it is something. Whatever that something is, it is not both a wave and a particle. To say that when we look at what we call light, we observe just a wave is incorrect. Since, yes, something has to be doing the waving. But at the same time, saying that it is just a particle may also be incorrect. Not unless you can explain the observation of wave behavior. Perhaps when we look at light, we are observing particles with wave behavior, or particles in something else exhibiting wave behavior. What we do know is that when we observe light, sometimes we seem to observe particle behavior, such as when we observe the photoelectric effect, and sometimes wave behavior, such as what we observe when we perform the double slit experiment. We do not dispute these experiments and their outcomes, or that they indeed tell us about the properties of light. What we dispute is that the particle-wave duality explains what light actually is. To explain what light is, you need to explain why it sometimes is observed as a particle and other times a wave. That certainly could mean that our current understanding of what light is in fact incorrect. It certainly seems that our understanding of light is incomplete, that we have failed to properly explain why we observe what we call light, to sometimes have particle behavior and other times wave behavior. In fact, de Broglie and others have tried to suggest pilot wave theories, some of which might help to bridge this gap in our grasp of light. They propose the observation of what we call light actually involves a particle accompanied by a wave. What is doing the waving is an interesting question, but we will not go into that here. These theories tend to be too easily dismissed. But is this wise? Perhaps one day we shall find out. That very well may require a very different idea of what light is than most people accept. And as for whether or not a field qualifies as a thing that waves, well, what is a field? Physicists often define a field as a quantity assigned to various points of space. So basically, a series of numbers. Now, the problem is that many physicists think that a field itself explains something. For instance, they might assert that the electromagnetic field explains the behavior of charged particles. But it doesn't. The field allows one to calculate the behavior and properties of charged particles. But it does not itself explain why those properties have those values and why the particles behave the way they do. For that, you need to explain how the field works. You need to explain what it is about the entities involved and their relationships which cause the behavior described by the field. But the short version of the answer is that no. Since according to this definition, a field is simply a mathematical description of properties and actions, then it cannot qualify as a thing that waves. Now let's take this definition of a field. That is to say, a field is, quote, a region where each point is affected by a force, unquote. Well, a region of space clearly cannot wave, since it is just a relationship. Things in that region might wave around and explain how the force manifests, but that is not the same as the field being a wave or the field waving. Using either definition of a field, it is an abstraction dealing with entities and relationships between them. The field still needs a physical explanation in terms of things that exist, not numbers attached to space. And if you define a field as a region where each point is affected by force, you need to physically explain the force. I hope that clarifies and answers your question, Steve. And that was the last question, which brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to check out the website and subscribe if you like our podcast, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to get the updates. You can also support us on Patreon. Any amount contributed is received with appreciation and goes towards time and resources spent on producing and promoting the show. You are welcome to send in questions about any of the things talked about in this episode, or about irrational stuff in physics or the philosophy of science in general. Send them in to questions@metaphysicsofphysics.com. Thanks for listening. Please tune in for the next episode and start thinking of some questions. Until then, stay rational.